We continue now at the top of Daf Samech Aleph Amud Aleph and Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 61a. On the previous summit, the Gemara asked, we'll take a look at Rashi, this is going on the previous summit, the Gemara asked, Ribis bekesef minayin. How do you know that Ribis applies by money, meaning when the term Ribis is used in the Torah, it refers not only to lending food, but also to lending money, meaning she'over af belav sheni shall Ribis, meaning that there's going to be two transgressions. You're going to have, if a person lends with money, you're going to have neshech, one violation of neshech, and you'll also have a second violation of a negative commandment of Ribis. And so Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says belova, meaning again by the lova we have psukim by the lender and psukim by the borrower. Pasuk says by the borrower neshech kesef. It says the word neshech kesef. We'll see the Gemara in a moment, but we'll read Rashi in advance. Me'eno inyan legufo. Now, if we don't need neshech kesef for what it's talking about there, l'chayvo al lav shel neshech, that there's a transgression here of violating the lav of neshech. Sharei kvar nemar barosh hamikra. It already says that at the beginning of the pasuk. It says lo sashach. It already says that. Uvesofo nemar kol davar asher yishach, and then in the end it says anything. So Tanei Inyan l'rabos kesef. So therefore, instead we're going to say that it's going to include Tanei Inyan rather l'ribis kesef. It's going to include ribis. That by ribis we have kesef as well. Ribis does not only apply to ochel. V'hashta d'shaminan mi lo sashich bein kesef uvein ochel. Now, once we know from lo sashich, from that pasuk that it applies to both money and food, ayasru tarvayu neshech kesef and neshech ochel. Now both are extra. The words neshech kesef and neshech ochel are both extra. L'chayev es halova al lav shel ribis al shneihen. Therefore, the lova, the borrower, is now going to be responsible. He's going to be chayiv for both negative commandments if he borrows on interest. And so the Gemara now says again, "Imenu inyan l'neshech kesef." If you don't need it for neshech kesef, sharei kvar nemar lo sashich liachicha, because it already says lo sashich at the beginning of the pasuk, as Rashi noted. So taneyu inyan l'ribis kesef. So instead, you should include the idea that ribis applies by money as well, not just food. And ein li ela belov. I only know this by the borrower. B'malva minayin. How do we know to apply this by the lender? Nemar neshech belova v'nemar neshech b'malva. It uses the word neshech by the borrower. It uses it by the lender. Ma neshech ha'amar belova lo chilakta bo ben bekesef ben b'ochel. Just like the neshech by the borrower, there's no distinction between kesef and ochel. Ben neshech ben b'ribis. No distinction between neshech and ribis. Af neshech ha'amar b'malva. So too the word neshech by the lender. Lo sach lukubo ben bekesef ben b'ochel. There's no distinctions if it's with money or food. Ben neshech ben ribis. No distinctions between neshech and ribis. Now minayin l'rabos kol davar. Now the Gemara says, well, how do we know to include everything? Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says neshech kol davar asher yishach. It says in the pasuk anything, and that applies there, essentially that it means that ribis applies to all types of lending for a profit. And the Gemara continues, Ravina says, lo neshech b'ochel v'lo ribis b'kesef tzrich yikra. The fact that neshech applies by ochel and the fact that ribis applies by kesef, it doesn't even require any extra psukim. Dichsiv es kas v'chalo sitin lo b'neshech v'yochlech b'marbis. Now if the pasuk would have phrased it in that fashion, don't give your money in neshech and your food in marbis, kedekamrit, so then you're right, then you would have needed extra psukim to say that neshech applies not only by kesef but also by ochel, and marbis applies not only by ochel but also by kesef. But hashda dichsiv es kas v'chalo sitin lo b'neshech uv'marbis lo sitin achlecha. Now that it's phrased the way it is, where it says don't give your money in neshech uv'marbis, the word marbis comes right after the word neshech. That's the point over here. By marbis, for marbis you shouldn't give your food. So we can read the psukim in both directions. Kari behacha, you can read the pasuk as follows: as kas b'chalo sitin lo b'neshech uv'marbis. So money now applies to both neshech and marbis. And then you can read the second half of the pasuk starting from the word b'neshech uv'marbis lo sitin achlecha. And then b'neshech b'marbis, don't give your food. And therefore you understand that both terms apply to both money and to food. But the Gemara continues, Vatana nemar ka'amar. But the Gemara is now asking a question on Ravina, because Ravina is an Amora, and we just had a Brisa before, and so the Brisa says nemar, as if the Brisa seems to be saying you do need psukim to teach this. And the Gemara says, Hachi kamar, this is what it means to say. Ilu lo nemar kref, not for the pasuk hayisi omer gzeira shava. I would have said a gzeira shava. Achshav shenemar kref, but now that we do have a pasuk gzeira shava lo tzarach, you don't actually need the gzeira shava. And so the Gemara then says, well, if that's the case, I'll gzeira shava lamali. So if we don't actually need the gzeira shava, what is the gzeira shava for? And the Gemara says, leneshach kol davar asher yishach to lo kasab b'malva. You do need the gzeira shava for the following, because we learn from the pasuk of kol davar asher yishach that it applies to all things. So we don't see that pasuk happens to be written by the borrower, not the lender. So how do we know by the lender as well that it applies to all things? That is learned through the gzeira shava. And Rashi explains, Ravina Amar lo neshech b'ochel v'lo ribis b'kesef tzrichi kro. You don't need the pasuk to tell us neshech by ochel and ribis by kesef lemigmar b'malvim in halova. You don't need to learn from the lender from the borrower. The v'gufo ksiv can mefarsh v'yazal. Just from the way it's written by the lender, we can understand it. Kedekoamr neshech koya kesef umar bis ha'ochel. Again, if it would be written slightly different, then you would have had a point that maybe neshech seems to go only on kesef and marbis only on ochel. But the way it's written, it could be going both on both. And then the Gemara asks, "V'atana nemar kamar migzera shava nafkli." The Tana does bring a gzera shava. V'hechi polag amora Tana v'amar de migufa yolef. How can Amora Ravina argue on the brisa? And so the Gemara answered, Hachi Kamar, this is what it means to say, Hachi Kamar Tana Ilulo Nemar Krab, meaning if there hadn't been a pasuk, B'derech HaNishma L'Shneim, if the pasuk didn't say it in a way where we could learn out both terms for both of them, Afal Pichein Ha'yisi Lomda B'Gzera Shava, I could have learned it from a Gzera Shava, V'hashta Gzera Shava, Lo Tzarech Lachi, right now we don't need the Gzera Shava for that, and so then the Gemara eventually went on to say why we do need the Gzera Shava. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava says, Lamali dekasav Rachmana lav beribis, lav begezel, lav beona. Why does the pasuk need to have negative commandments by ribis, by interest, and by gezel, by stealing, and by ona, by situations of exploitation? And Rashi explains, Lamali lav beribis, lav begezel, yilmadu zemizeh. Can't we learn out one from the other? Shebekulan chisar mammon, shemechasar eschaver. Aren't they all essentially the same thing? You're causing your friend to lose money. Why do we need psukim by all of them? And the Gemara continues, because of Rachmana la beribis, if the pasuk only said a negative commandment by ribis, by interest, mishum dechidishu, the reason for that is that's a chiddush. The afilu belova asur Rachmana, because even the lova, the borrower, who's the one that's losing the money, he also is prohibited. The lav applies to him as well. Because of Rachmana lav begezel, if we only had a lav by gezel, by stealing, mishum de bal karchi, there you're taking money against the person's will. Avalona, but when it comes to exploitation, it's essentially a business deal where the person is overcharging or vice versa. Ein malos, I might say it doesn't apply there. Because of Rachmana lav ve'onan, if we only had lav ve'onan, mishum de lo yada de machal, because he's not aware of what's going on, so he can't really be mochel, he can't really forgive. And so then the Gemara says, well, chadam echada lo asi. So we understand why you can't learn one from one, but teisi chadam itarti. Why not take two of them? And once we have two of these negative commandments, meaning to say, let's say you had ribis and gezel, couldn't you learn out the third ona, or whichever two you would pick, as the Gemara now says? And so the Gemara says, hey teisi, well, which one do you want to learn out from the other two? Lo lichtov rachmana la beribis. Let's say that the Torah did not write a negative commandment by interest. V'teisi mihanach, and you'll try to learn out ribis from the other two, but you can't learn it out because malahanach shekain shalom midas, because again, those two, meaning by gezel and onah, that's shalom midas, the person's not aware. Tomar beribis to midaite, whereas when it comes to interest, when it comes by ribis, that's midaite, that they're the person it is with his knowledge. And so then you'll say, lo lichtov rachmana lav be'onah. Okay, so let the Torah not write anything by onah, by exploitation, v'teisi mihanach, you learn it out from the others. Malahalach shekain ein derech mekach umemkar. When it comes to those other cases, those are not done through a normal way of a business transaction of buying and selling, meaning to say ribis is talking about a situation of a loan, stealing obviously is not derech mekach umemkar, so malahalach shekein ein derech mekach umemkar, that's not the normal way of a business transaction. And so instead the Gemara says, lo lichtov rachmana lav begezel, let the Torah not write about stealing, v'teisei mehanach, we can learn it out if you can't exploit, if you can't lend by interest, certainly you can't steal. Demai paracht, because how are you going to refute that? How are you going to refute that way of learning out? Mal ribis shekein chiddush, you'll say, well, ribis is a chiddush, like we said, it applies to the borrower. Ona tochiach, ona is not a chiddush, it proves the other way. Mal ona shekein lo yado machil, by the case of ona, it's a chiddush, he doesn't know, he's not aware, and he has to be mochel. Ribis tochiach, so ribis can prove the other way, v'chazar adin, and then it goes back and forth. Lo roizeh karoizeh, v'lo roizeh karoizeh. This one is not like this one, and this one's not like this one, meaning to say ribis and ona, they're not exactly alike, each one is unique in its own way. Hatzara shavash behen shekein gozlo, the common denominator between the two is that there is stealing going on. Afani yavi gezel, so too I can understand gezel. We don't need to have a pasuk when it comes to gezel. And Rashi explains, the afila below vasar achmana, again, ribis is a chiddush, because even the borrower is prohibited to borrow with interest. V'gazar alav shelo yitanenu. The Torah has a gzeira. The Torah says that the lov is not allowed to give the interest. V'ikol lememar chidushu shechit Torah bezu v'lo shasar lechatzras chaveru. You could already say this is already a novel idea that Torah has. Not that it's just a general thing that it's prohibited to make your friend lose money, but derech acher in some other way. Do azharas lov elamish on the mechaser. Obviously, the lov is not being warned because he's making the other one lose money. He's the one losing money, yet he's warned. When it comes to ona, when it comes to gezel, it's lo midaite. Now Rashi explains what that means. Ona lo yadibe. First of all, by ona, the person's not even aware. Gezel al karche shakal. Now gezel also is considered lo midaite because it's against his will. The money is being taken against his will. Tomar beribis the midaito nosin lo. Whereas when it comes to interest, it's all midas. He's giving him it willingly, knowingly. Shekein derech mekach umemkar. And then he said that the other cases are not mekach umemkar. It's not buying and selling. Tomar bona she derech mekach umemkar. Ona is a situation where it's just done in the normal way of a transaction. It does happen. People need a particular object. They're willing to buy it for more than it's worth. And then the Gemara said, Lo lichto begezel v'teisei mehanach. Just don't write by gezel. You learn gezel from the other two. Because then any way you refute it, for example, you'll say you can't learn from ribis because it's novel. Tomar begezel. So then you could say gezel again is not novel. So therefore you say you can't learn it out. But ona tochiach. But ona will prove the other way because there's a lav by ona, and that's not a chiddush. It's not novel. Mal ona shekein lo yada demochel. And then you'll say, well, by ona he's not aware of it to be mochel. Tomar begezel diyada. Whereas when it comes to gezel, he is aware of what's going on. It's against his will, but he's aware. You could say that he already gave up and he was mochel, he forgave it. Ribis tochiach, then ribis proves the other way. And again, v'chazar adin, it goes back and forth like a classic tzad hashava. Hatzad hashava shebehen shemechas romamun. The tzad hashava, the common denominator, is the person's losing money. Afani avi gezel, so too I will include the case of gezel. And the Gemara continues, Amri, they answer, Hachinami, indeed what you're saying is correct. Technically, you could learn out Gezel from the other two. Elalav begezel lamali, so why is it that we have a negative commandment by Gezel? Lechovesh schar sacher, that's to say that you're also not allowed to withhold the wages of a worker. Rashi says, Lechovesh schar sacher, de lo mata liyade. He never got the money, v'lo mechasrli, so it's not like you're really taking something away from him, you're just not giving him what's rightfully his. You're not giving him his wages, that's what Gezel comes to include. But the Gemara continues, Kovesh schar sacher, behedyuk Kovish schar sacher, there is a pasuk about that. The pasuk says, Lo sashok sachir ani v'evion. So therefore, if there's already a pasuk that you can't withhold wages from somebody, so what do I need Gezel to teach us something that's already in the pasuk? And so the Gemara says, well, lav or ala b'shnei lavin. You're right, it's already a pasuk, but we have another pasuk of Gezel to say that there's actually two transgressions. That's why we need the pasuk of Gezel. Well, the Gemara says, once you have that logic, v'lukma b'ribis v'ona, you might as well say that the Gezel pasuk is talking about ribis or ona, v'lav or ala b'shnei lavin, and say that there's going to be two violations, two negative commandments. And the Gemara says to that, davar halamin me'nyana, we learn it out from its context, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Samech Aleph Amud Beis.